All right, welcome everyone. We're very privileged tonight to welcome to the school Dr. Michael Woolcock. Michael's is a lecturer at the Harvard Kennedy School, lead social science researcher in the World Bank Research Department. No, sorry, lead social scientist. Something related to social science and research and being a lead at it in the World Bank. And author of a whole host of articles and books, most recently Building State Capability, Evidence, Analysis, and Action, which is a great book which is wonderfully available open source, so you can just download a PDF online, and is a great guide for academics and practitioners alike. Michael's someone who's been a huge influence not only on a lot of work that's gone on in the World Bank and international development space, but on a lot of academics who work on these kind of topics, myself included. So it's a real pleasure to be welcoming Michael here. Mike's going to speak until maybe a little bit before 7, and then we're going to do some Q&A. We know the event technically only runs until 7, so if you do have to head out at 7, then we'll try not to be offended. So with that, let me hand it over to Michael.
Thanks, Martin, and thanks to Jamie in particular for organizing this visit for me today. It's great to be back at Oxford and to have a chance to talk to you about a book and an agenda, a book that we, with my co-authors Matt Andrews and Lant Pritchett, we published early last year, but was part of a bigger strategy for engaging with these big questions around implementation. It seemed to us that most of our discussions, certainly at the Kennedy School and at the World Bank, the epicenter of thinking and doing was sort of polarized at the beginning and at the end of the process. Lots of energy around designing policy in some particular way, and then having a group of people show up at the end sort of to evaluate and say, yes, it did, or no, it didn't work. But that missing middle, the connection between the design and the assessment seemed to us a really crucial part. And as I will try and show you today, I think this particular component is both super important for realizing the agenda that the world itself has signed up for, but one that also needs some serious rethinking in terms of how we engage with it. So I'm going to provide a critique of orthodoxy in some sense, just because I think that's kind of what you do in the academic space. But the critique is relatively easy and relatively safe. Trying to imagine, trying to articulate, and then trying to implement an alternative to that is harder. And we had the temerity to imagine that we could at least begin the process of providing what an alternative to our prevailing orthodoxy on implementation might look like, and I will outline some of that today, but do so in the spirit of a sort of a 1.0 version of this. If it was obvious what should be done, we would have figured out what to do a long time ago. This really is something that will require the collective talents of professionals of all kinds around the world. Indeed, I would suggest the most likely place where the resolution to these kinds of conundrums will come from will probably be from frontline people, particularly in the global south, where these questions are just going to be only ever increasing in the decades to come. So I think obviously that nice places like Oxford and Harvard have a crucial role to play in that process, but I think what we're seeing in the beginnings of the 21st century is a major reorientation of where we look for the kinds of answers to the very context-specific places in which these very vexing, very ancient problems, but very much 21st century manifestations of these ancient problems are becoming apparent. And I would indeed suggest often the binding constraint on moving things forward. So the title for today's presentation for astute readers of Albert Hirschman will be familiar. It comes from the Development Projects Observed. He very wisely intoned more than 50 years ago that this whole question of implementation was often tripped up by the very complexity of trying to carry out the work of projects, especially those that were affected by a high degree of initial ignorance and uncertainty. And indeed, he sort of coined this bigger metaphor for saying that in project implementation, in fact, may often mean that we need to embark on a long voyage of discovery in the most varied of domains, from technology to politics, to figure this out. In the 20th anniversary of this same book, he sort of upped the ante even more by saying it wasn't merely just a long voyage of discovery. In fact, development itself should be described as an epic adventure. And I love that idea of thinking about development as an epic adventure, as noble, worthy, deeply uncertain, the outcome never sure, but needing and worthy of being undertaken nonetheless. So what I'm going to do is speak to you around 4 different domains. As Martin indicated, the book itself that I'm going to talk about is structured around these 3 sort of key issues around evidence, analysis, and action. But I want to open by giving you a sense of what the rationale is for why we might do this kind of work and why it's so important in the first place. I'm going to argue, perhaps strongly and provocatively, that state capability for implementation is pretty much the key development issue of the 21st century. We often know what we should be doing in principle. We just don't have the organizational apparatus in place to be able to do what needs to be done. And I want to stress, or at least argue for, a different space for engaging with these kinds of questions. I will move from that to sort of outline the evidentiary basis on which we make some of these big claims about the rather disconcerting state of state capability around the world right now. We have an array of different methodological entry points into these discussions, and the sort of narrative arc I want to take is sort of thoroughly depress you and then sort of rise at the end with some more hopeful account of how this long voyage of discovery might be embarked upon. But I think we have to be a little spooked by the scale of ambition that the world has laid before itself, as we'll see with the Sustainable Development Goals. But so often, I think, with a scant consideration of whether the prevailing administrative system tasked with doing any of this work can actually do it. And more particularly, if it can't do that, if we deem it to be unable to do that, what our strategy is for helping that system acquire the kind of capability it will need to do that kind of work. With this evidence in mind, I will then try and look at and explain why we're in such a conundrum. Why have we been in this business for so long and spent so much money doing these works of organizational reform in one kind or another, and yet seem to have such little to show for it? Countries like Malawi, for example, have just spent billions of dollars over the last 25 years. Their growth in 1990 was at levels were roughly those of Mexico, and it's pretty much flatlined over the course of the last 25 years or so, with very little to show for all of this effort that has been put in trying to improve its public sector. But the story can be told in so many different places, in so many different ways. If we are going to argue for, as I will, a more adaptive approach to thinking about these things, really trying to create a space for engaging with problems for which there's lots of human interaction, lots of discretion, lots of uncertainty about what we're doing, and often, indeed, lots of resistance to what needs to be done, then we need to explain why previous efforts to try and do this didn't go so well. And if I'm going to invoke Hirschman-esque kinds of arguments for engaging on long voyages to discovery, and if that was made over 50 years ago, and people even earlier than that made similar kinds of critiques about the prevailing administrative systems, then we have to explain why those critiques never dislodged orthodoxy. Why were they so durable? Why were they so resistant to critique that had come along, as we'll see, pretty much every decade since then, and not shifted this equilibrium? So if I'm going to propose something as an alternative, I have to have a pretty good account of why we think this is going to work a little better than what has gone on before. Right? If I'm going to do that, then I want to spend the final bit of the time we have talking about how we beat something with something better. How we not engage not just in critique, which is, as indicated before, is the relatively easy part. How we engage in articulating what an alternative to that might look like. Because we're in development, we have to have an acronym for our alternative. Ours is called Problem-Driven Iterative Adaptation, PDIA. I'll give you the sort of the skeletal outlines of what that approach looks like, but more concretely give you some examples of different countries and sectors around the world where people have been brave enough or crazy enough to actually take us seriously and try and put some of this into action. Very much at the early stages of it, where it sort of feels a bit like we've jumped out of the plane and have to design our parachute before we hit the ground. But that's the essence of doing fun and interesting work in this space. If it was, as I said before, if it was easy or obvious what we should be doing, smart people have already figured this out. It's not obvious what we should do, but we have to try and do something different, and I think we have the contours, at least, of the outline for what that system might look like. So that's what we're going to go over the next 45 minutes or so. Right? So the overall rationale for this is that the development challenge just keeps getting harder. As Aldous Huxley said many years ago, every ceiling once reached becomes a floor, right? So once you've attained one level of satisfaction or one degree of accomplishment, it becomes the new normal, and that then becomes the basis on which we try and take on something ever more harder. And I would suggest to you that the development challenges don't sort of peter out and sort of become easier as a society itself develops. In fact, we get increasingly comfortable with the fact that we have 24/7 electricity, clean water, safe food to eat all the time. These amazing confluence of organizational systems that we're moving in and out of every day and take entirely for granted largely. They are extraordinary accomplishments of human history, that we can do these kinds of things and be participants in these things and entirely oblivious to just how awesome they are in terms of raising human welfare. But if for countries like Rwanda, which have set themselves the task of becoming a high-income country by 2050, the next 32 years, they're supposedly going to be going from 161st in the world that they are now to being in the top 30 in the OECD. That's just going to be a complete transformation in what their prevailing systems right now can actually do. And as much as that ambition itself is laudable, we have to have, I suggest, a corresponding strategy for those kinds of tasks if we're going to see anything like them be realized. But when you look at the Sustainable Development Goals and compare them at least to their predecessors, the Millennium Development Goals, you'll see that every country in the world, not just Rwanda, has essentially signed on to phantasmagorical types of claims about what we're going to be achieving in the next 12 years by the year 2030. Right? In goal number 3, we're claiming that we're going to achieve healthy lives for everyone at all ages. If you look at the Millennium Development Goals in education, for example, they were exclusively butts on seats goals. They were enrollment goals. We were just going to make sure that kids showed up for school every day. Right? Well, if that was good enough in the year 2000, by 2015, 193 governments in the world had decided that in fact, that wasn't adequate, that we'd reached that kind of ceiling. The new ceiling we were going to strive for was, in fact, achieving lifelong learning for all. And I'm very conscious that here at the Blavatnik School, you have my colleague, Roland Pritchett's, the projects that he runs on looking at research on improving systems for education, the RISE program. There's a really important initiative to try and engage with that exact question. How do we help kids to actually learn when so many of the countries around the world, even middle-income countries, are really, really struggling, not just to get kids into the school called a building and provide them with textbooks and give them nice computers to play with. How can we actually help those systems to deal with the very vexing social problem of educating kids? I just spent much of the last 2 years based in Malaysia. Malaysia is a high middle-income country with visions of becoming itself a high-income country by 2020. But 51% of Malaysian 15-year-olds cannot read a headline in a newspaper effectively and cannot do double-digit subtraction. Right? That's a high middle-income country that's on the cusp of becoming part of the rich country clubs of the world, and yet almost half its population is still effectively unable to hold down a pretty routine job of following instruction manuals and the like in a factory system. Right? So those are the countries that are doing pretty well in development, let alone the ones, as we'll see shortly, that are much further behind. Right? Everyone in this room essentially is a product of about, at least I would guesstimate, about 18,000 hours of human interaction. That's how long it roughly, about 1,000 hours per year is what it takes to produce you and me. That's how many years we've spent having people called teachers interact with us on an hour-by-hour, week-by-week basis to be able to turn us into the modern people that can come to a nice lecture and hear each other talk at a pretty high level about these kinds of questions. That kind of level of deep social interaction is what it takes to make an educational system functional. And yet, despite over 150 years of trying to figure out how to make that system work for everyone, we still really haven't done that. A lot of my particular work focuses on these questions that are encapsulated in goal number 16, the Sustainable Development Goal on peace and inclusion. Well, there, we're going to achieve justice for all and accountability at all levels. That's what 193 governments think we're going to be able to do by the year 2030. But if you're even minimally biblically literate, you will know that the United Nations building has that wonderful phrase from Isaiah, chiseled in stone, literally outside the front of the building. For over 2,500 years, the world has aspired to turn its swords into plowshares, to bring about peace and justice and prosperity for all. And yet we're somehow going to do that in the next 12 years. So these are fantastical kinds of claims that the world has set for itself. And one can either be deeply cynical about this and just sort of say, well, clearly the world actually doesn't take these very seriously at all, otherwise they would never sign up for such outlandish kinds of goals. Or we can take them actually very seriously, and we can say, man, it's just historically unprecedented that 193 governments in the world would sign up and pledge themselves to achieve this kind of work, and I'm predominantly in that latter category. I think history will be very kind to a world that once upon a time thought that this was what it could actually do. But it creates a space, and I think that's the most important thing that these kinds of goals do. They create a space for precisely the kinds of conversations we're having right now about how we will engage with these very vexing perennial questions of how we do a much better job of implementing. Compounding these big challenges that we've set empirically is there's a demographic reality that in sub-Saharan Africa, at least over the next 30 years or so, the populations are going to double. Right? So in a country like Cameroon, for example, which pretty much deeply struggles to provide education systems for its citizens, its young people right now, that same system is now going to be asked to deal with twice as many kids in the next 20 or 30 years or so. Right? That demographic bulge is just waiting to happen in a whole bunch of countries around the world that themselves are just deeply struggling to do what they need to do now, let alone what's going to happen when we ask it to do twice as many things. And one of the reasons for saying that development just keeps getting harder is that once you actually succeed in development, you completely change the tasks that the public sector is being asked to do. A world in which the life expectancy of people is 45 has a very different set of diseases, has a very different demands for our pension systems, very different demands for even the concept of retirement, very different demands on what public transport and a whole range of other things are actually going to be needing and looking like. So as we succeed in development, as we do the kinds of things that we've long aspired to do, we just keep ratcheting up a whole different set of challenges that just keep kicking in. As people live longer, they have smaller families. If they have smaller families, they have more dispersed families. And so there has to be a whole professionalized system of care for elderly people. That costs a heck of a lot of money. That has to be regulated. That has to be funded. That has to be implemented. Right? So all of these things are happening as a result of development success, not as a result of development failure. And as the aging process happens, as the urbanization process happens, as the demands on water and sewerage and all the rest just keep getting harder and harder and harder, there has to be a complementary strategy for building out an implementation apparatus that can plausibly begin to do all of that. Right? So I think those are really, really crucial tasks that are inadequately conceived when we start to just think that our task is to set big ambitious goals and think that the very laudability and ambition of those scales, of those ambitions, is itself going to do the work of somehow realizing them. We have to have a corresponding strategy that underpins all of that. The third sort of thing that I think is compounding all of this is that our prevailing aid systems were not set up to do this. Right? When the Bretton Woods institutions were set up and built out in the mid-20th century, it was not in the wildest imaginations of the people convening at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods that we would be trying to build a world full of peace and inclusion for all, that would have gender empowerment as a goal, that we would have the provision of transport for all as a goal. These are things that never were part of the original agenda. Even poverty reduction is not officially part of the original charter of the World Bank. Right? So as the scale of the ambition expands, we just have to recognize that I think that the prevailing systems we have, the multilateral systems that we have for doing this kind of work, really just aren't fit for purpose. They were not designed to do this. They were designed to do what Paul Romer once called fill object gaps. They were designed to build roads and bridges and irrigation systems and the like. They were largely about technocratic or macroeconomic reforms of one kind or another. So if you could hire engineers, accountants, and macroeconomists to do the technical work of engaging in reform, that was largely what was conceived of as the development problem and as the development solution and when the founding principles and founding structures of the Bretton Woods institutions were set up. But now we're asking them to do things at a scale and a degree of complexity that are just vastly beyond what was ever originally conceived. So to use an analogy, I'm going to sort of argue essentially that what we're finding ourselves needing to do is or what we're asking our systems to do is to run open source software on mid-20th century operating systems, or to use a more close analogy, to run Firefox on DOS. We're really trying to engage with systems that need a much more open and collaborative basis for integration, and yet we keep loading this up on a mid-20th century operating system and wonder why our computers keep crashing and why we have to keep rebooting them as the only seeming way in which we can go about fixing this. We have the big existential tasks of not just having individual projects or individual systems be improved, but the whole operating system itself, I suggest, really needs to be fundamentally rethought. One of the reasons for taking history very seriously in this space is precisely because I think we can draw enormous inspiration from what our grandparents and great-grandparents did faced with these kinds of challenges and built out a system that at the time was an extraordinary accomplishment, given the scale of the challenges that they faced at the time, with only a failed set of multilateral institutions in their rearview mirror as the basis on which to draw. That story is so important, I think, for us to understand. But those situations, those moments of revitalization happened because of global war, because of complete failures of those international systems to do the work that they had been tasked with doing. And we should all be praying that we don't have a World War III that is the basis on which we need to revisit some of these things. I think if I want to scare myself with this stuff, I just think the scale of what we've asked our systems to do and the inability of those systems, as we'll see shortly, to do much of what we're now asking them to do, just puts a huge burden on those of us in our professional years in the early 21st century to build out, imagine, and crucially implement a much better way of engaging with these. And our humble sort of contribution to all of this stuff, which I will get to later, is just one among several different approaches that are being explored right now in different places and in different sectors around the world. And we've just got to keep allowing those different kinds of approaches to have a moment of flourishing to be able to see ultimately which one is able to do the work that we need it to do. Fortunately, we have Goal 17, the last of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, with its emphasis on strengthening the means of implementation. So for all of the high ambition articulated more empirically in the first 16 of these goals, at least I think there was the good sense to recognize that for any of these other 16 to happen, there had to be something like a focus on implementation to make those happen. And none of those goals, I should stress, on justice and social inclusion, none of these questions on implementation were even a few years ago in 2000 articulated and formalized in the Millennium Development Goals. So there is a genuine analytic progress, at least, in recognizing that we need to engage with these things, but there is just so much more that needs to happen for that to be realized. Okay, let's put some just empirical foundations underneath some of these big claims that I've been making about the rather sorry state of state capability. In the opening part of the book that Martin mentioned before, Building State Capability, with the first half of the book and the first few chapters of the book are spent trying to lay out just what the current state of state capability is around the world. And we draw on a whole spectrum of social science research, as you'll see, ranging from experiments through to cross-country indicators, through to various different sectoral experiments to really try and show that, without cherry-picking, that pretty much wherever you turn, there's a deep concern about what our prevailing systems seem to be able to do. So I'll start with the big cross-country indices that exist, that the World Bank and others have been collecting now for the best part of 20 years. There's a whole critique around all of this, as there should be, and as some of you are familiar with. But nonetheless, in the age in which we live, it's almost inevitable that someone will come up with some big index of something. So we have done the best to be faithful to the best of those particular indices and use those as best we can to construct our own index of state capability. The axis on the left just looks at the current levels of what they are, where each of the countries is or was over the last 20 years, and then the pace of change, whether they're going rapidly negative, slowly negative, slowly positive, or then rapidly positive. The countries in the circle there are the only ones that we can currently guesstimate, using admittedly pretty crude extrapolations, are on pace to become Portugal by the end of the 21st century. Why do we say Portugal? Because Portugal is the lowest level you can have and still be in the OECD club. Right? Originally, we articulated a paper where we said we should get to Denmark, and we sort of were trying to get to the apex. No, we've lowered our ambitions now. We just want to get to, countries should aspire to be as good as the weakest of the rich countries. And that's Portugal with inverted commas, not Portugal, the actual country. So it turns out that is kind of accurate. But the idea of being the standard we set should be what it takes to be in the rich country club of the world, the OECD. Right? So those countries in circles and the numbers in brackets after it are just sort of the number of years it will take for Indonesia, for example, to get to the level of Portugal, currently 68, Colombia 56, etc. But if you look at the countries that are in the red boxes, those are negative, so by definition, they're never going to get there at their current pace. Or we have some sort of fantastical numbers for Ukraine, for example, 1,216 years, which if you do a graph of that, that means they're across the street in Oxford University Press's building in terms of the kind of pace of change that they're on. Now, as we like to say in Washington at the moment, these numbers are numbers you should take seriously but not literally. They're sort of extrapolations. They're just indicative of what our prevailing indices on the state capabilities tell us with regards to the pace of change that countries are on. Another way of talking about those countries that are circled is basically to say that only 10% of the people alive today in the historically developing countries will have grandchildren who will live in Portugal, who will live in a country that has high levels of capability by the end of the 21st century. That means 90% of the world today will not make that journey, right? And that should be completely unacceptable if we have simultaneously set up as a world in which we aspire to achieve all of these very first world goal kinds of targets in our sustainable development goals. Just to focus in on one particular country, this is Guatemala. Right? Guatemala, you can just set upper and lower bounds for what strong capability would look like and what low capability currently looks like, and you can set what the current lower and upper bounds look like. And even in the most optimistic scenario, Guatemala is on a 2,000-year journey to become part of the Rich Country Club. Even longer, though, if we just took its current pace of change over the last 10 years or the last 20 years. Right? So again, these are just basic extrapolations. One can overinterpret these, and I don't want to do that. I'm just saying that if we use the prevailing data we have as it exists right now and look at it, how it's changed over the last 20 years, and just to look at that level and pace of change, do that to the world's countries, you're in a world where most people will not be able, over the course of the rest of this century, to be in a world in which they will have levels of capability that are even minimally able to achieve the kinds of ambitions that we've set. Some of you might only believe what comes out of experiments. Okay, this is a cute little experiment that some colleagues did at Harvard. One of the most basic things that any country does is deliver the mail. There is no opposition force that stands at your door preventing the mailman or woman from doing his or her job. It is the most logistical, least controversial task that governments anywhere in the world do. The beauty of this for experimental purposes is that 157 governments in the world have signed, among many other things, a simple agreement that says, if you receive a misaddressed envelope, you will return it to the country from whence it came. Right? That's what 157 countries have said. If you receive a misaddressed envelope, we will hereby send it back on the plane or boat from whence it came. So some Harvard colleagues a few years ago deliberately sent out 10 misaddressed envelopes to all 157 countries, set their stopwatches and waited to see how long it would take for each of these countries to send back their misaddressed envelopes, to implement their policy. They have signed an international agreement saying they will respond to this big challenge by sending back the envelopes. Right? Well, if you're from the Czech Republic, you win the prize for having the best postal system, at least the ones that followed these particular rules. Most countries, though, even the ones down the bottom, are countries that have had postal systems for quite a long time, quite a long-standing history with doing this. Again, one could overinterpret this, and maybe if you're a poor country, the last thing you want to do is spend finite resources on sending letters back to silly Americans who can't figure out how to address their mail properly. Well, maybe that's true. But again, I think the important point, which I will elaborate on later, is that you see a full spectrum here. Right? You see literally 0 to 100. Some countries do not do this at all, and a handful of countries are actually able to do this kind of work. Right? What else can we do? We can look at one of my favorite photos in all of development. This is a photo of parents scaling a building in Bihar in India, literally smuggling in answers to their kids who are doing tests. Right? That is not a well-functioning education system, let me suggest. What's really depressing about that is not that parents are willing to scale tall buildings in a single bound to help their kids cheat their way through an exam, but the graph on the left, which shows that subsequent cohorts of kids going through Indian schools are actually doing worse, not better, right? And again, think of the demographic bulge that's coming through the Indian education system over the next couple of years. That's not a happy sign, that each of these trends, each cohort going through is doing worse than the one before. I think the most recent data is slightly more optimistic on this, that the graph hasn't just been on this inexorable decline, which is something and good. But again, this is not a world in which suddenly the ascent of improvement in education is happening. Most of the time it's flatlining, or in these particular sets of figures, they're actually getting worse. Right? Even more depressing, right? This is not just a problem for poor people living, for poor people living in poor countries. Look at the graph on the left, and this is a standard test that the OECD does periodically to look at the educational functionality of different systems around the world. And this number on the left there shows that graduates with tertiary degrees from Jakarta universities, or universities based in Jakarta, so we can reasonably assume that's sort of the upper middle class of Jakarta. All right, those kids are ending up with levels of literary functionality at the same as that of high school dropouts in Denmark. Right? So the kids who are the poorest or doing the worst off in a rich country like Denmark are performing at the same level as upper middle class students graduating from universities in Jakarta. On the right, data from a recent paper from colleagues working here on the RISE program. Again, it's a story of huge heterogeneity. Every country in the world literally has a policy that every kid should be in primary school and learning something. Right? But you can see that after the completed primary stage here, right, you literally have between 20 and 80% as the range of variation that's being achieved by different countries and systems around the world. Right? So huge variability, which we'll come back to again as a potential source of quite important insight into how and where we might explore some ways of moving these forward. But again, there's no world in which even at 80% you're going to be fulfilling the goals that the world has set with the Sustainable Development Goals of providing education for all at all levels. Right? And this isn't just a function of work in economics or anywhere else. I think if you look in anthropology, wonderful work that Akhil Gupta did several years ago on the largest and most progressive social program ever designed in the world for elderly women in India. A wonderful but tragic account of just how amazing it was that a program like this was able to be articulated and funded and designed. That's the first half of the book. Second half of the book is a weeping and gnashing of teeth account of what happened when the Indian Administrative Service, probably the hardest organization to get to in the entire world, harder to get into the IAS than it is to get into Harvard, what actually happened with the attempt to implement that particular program across India because of the inability of the administrative systems to actually monitor, measure, and engage with that actual challenge. Anne Swidler and Susan Watkins' wonderful book on what happens when aid money arrives into a small country like Malawi and completely swamps what is going on in those particular countries. But I think one of the great accomplishments of the Millennium, of the Sustainable Development Goals, is they're not just for developing countries, they're for everybody. 193 governments of the world, including the rich countries, including the UK, including Australia, have signed these particular goals. And yet, if you saw I, Daniel Blake, a few years ago, you would, I hope, be weeping in your seat as you were watching that. Not just as a powerful narrative, but here's what trying to implement a welfare state in the 21st century looks like for a government that's probably the proudest, longest history of being able to run a social welfare state. Right? And just a few weeks ago, The Secret Barrister, a sort of a tell-all tale about the rather parlous state of the justice system here in the UK. Right? So wherever you turn, everyone's looking thoroughly depressed, which is what you should be doing. This is the world we live in, even in rich countries, for rich people in poor countries, and especially for poor people in poor countries. Wherever you look, these systems that are charged with doing the work of implementing this thing we call public policy are just really, really struggling. And the professionals of the world, the citizens of the world, have to figure out a much better way of being able to engage with. We will not achieve in remotely any of the things that anybody is set up to do, even in the rich countries, if these are in fact the state of our systems for doing this kind of work. So now I want to transition into sort of discussing some of the analytics around this, around if most of the efforts to enhance state capability are struggling, how and why do such efforts continue to be supported? If this world that I've just described is as accurate as it is and as worrying as it is, how is the game of development able to keep spending billions of dollars each year on programs and on agendas for reform that seemingly are just not really achieving what they're supposed to be achieving? And the second question is, much of the critique that I'm about to level against the aid system is not especially new. The reason for opening with the Hirschman quote was precisely to show you that smart people who've been wrestling with these problems for a long time have raised similar kinds of questions, that the scale of complexity of these tasks that we face that are characterized by high levels of initial ignorance and complexity just don't map onto the tools that we have for doing this kind of work. So we have to be able to have a case for why any alternative in the early 21st century is going to stand a better chance than those that went before it. Well, let me have a stab at the first one, and this is, I think, chapter 4 of the book. Right? How is it that so many efforts at reform succeed and yet fail? Succeed in the administrative sense of being often scorecarded by evaluators as doing a pretty good job, and seemingly allow the next tranche of money to keep being dispersed on something that in the performative sense, in the outcome space, is really not being achieved. Well, one of the processes, one of the dynamics that we borrow from organizational sociology is this idea of isomorphic mimicry. The fact that we end up engaging in a whole series of reforms that change what systems look like rather than what they can actually do. And if you are in a world where what you count as success is how much money you've dispersed, whether the laws were passed, whether people were trained, whether the technology was sufficiently upgraded, whether money was dispersed on time, you can do all sorts of wonderful things in development and have nobody ever bat an eyelid. This is not a case of Dead Aid or any other books that have been written sort of regaling people with horror stories of corruption and money down rat holes that sort of never get used. Most of the kinds of stories that are being told in this space are entirely ones that don't cause any ripple effects back in capital cities from whence the money has come. There's no big scandal around this because they did exactly what they were supposed to do, except they didn't actually do what they were supposed to do, which is to fix the functionality of those systems. Let me just give sort of a visual embodiment of what I'm talking about when I say about isomorphic mimicry. This is a wonderful looking building from the country of the Solomon Islands, a country that had a civil war in the early parts of this century. And the nature of that civil war precipitated a multi-$100 million plus response from the Australian government in particular, but by a regional coalition of countries that was trying to respond to this particular challenge. What was the problem deemed to be? The outsiders deemed the problem to be the absence of an effective justice system. And so what's the prevailing way in which you respond to the absence of an effective justice system? You build things that look like an effective justice system, right? So you build wonderful looking courthouses like this building here. This is not a story or a tale of corruption and waste and profligacy. This is a wonderful building that was actually scored and rated incredibly highly back in Canberra. Why? Look at those fine chaps across the front. Those are all locally sourced labour that built this particular wonderful building at the cost of multiple tens of millions of dollars. Locally sourced labour used. Check. All those stones and wonderful wood that you see that comprise the building, was that sort of bought in by Australian companies from Australian businesses? No, 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 no. All of this was used locally. So locally sourced materials, big check. This particular building has no air conditioning, despite the fact that it's in a Pacific country. It has zero carbon footprint. Multiple checks on that one. Geez, it's fantastic if it can be scorecarded as having no carbon footprint usage. Why? Because it's situated just so that it captures the breezes coming in off the Pacific Ocean, so that it's all naturally cooled. People love this, right? This is a project that would be celebrated as a wonderful use of development resources. The only problem is that building gets used about twice a year. Right? So we've just blown roughly $30 million to build a fantastic looking building like that, and just around the corner, a new jail that's in compliance with Geneva standards, so that every jail cell has to meet certain dimensions. It has a weights room and exercise facility, because that's what the international rules require. 3 meals a day. It's got 8 people in it. Right? So all of this is not scandal. None of this is horror story. This is exactly what happens when certain kinds of people get to define what constitutes the problem and what constitutes the solution, fills it and provides the solution to that problem entirely on time, on budget, in compliance with every conceivable rule there is to make sure that these things happen the way they're supposed to happen, except they just exist in an entirely epiphenomenal space to where the actual problems for most Solomon Islanders occur most of the time. And if you had a very different entry point where you actually consulted with people and said, what do you think actually, everyday citizen, constitutes the development or the justice problems in your country, I don't think you would end up with an answer, man, the real reason that we have such awful things happening in our country is we don't have a $30 million courthouse and jail. Right? That is not the answer you get. The answer you get is that the justice system is captured. The justice system costs too much money. The justice system is too far away from where we live for our everyday disputes around property boundaries, around marital infidelity, around domestic violence. All the things that most people, most places have always fought each other about are just occurring in ways that are entirely separate to the way in which the international aid system is actually responding to those problems. Right? So that's how you can keep a system going for so long. You can count as success something that is administratively successful, but that has almost no bearing, exists in an entirely different space to the world in which the actual problems are occurring. To make things worse then, we can often then ask those new systems to start doing the work that we hoped that they would do, and then we're surprised or we wonder why they fail. When that sort of process happens, we call this premature load bearing. You're asking systems to do work that you thought they would be able to do just by providing some form of training, just by providing some form of technological upgrade, just by rearranging or organizing the organizational chart, but this and have almost no change in the way that things are actually functioning. Let me give you another example. Uganda. Uganda has had a big campaign to end corruption. And so the big strategy for ending that, the corruption problem was to design a wonderful new anti-corruption law. And a group in Washington, an NGO called Global Integrity, scorecarded Uganda's corruption law and gave it 99 out of 100. Right? You cannot buy better legal advice on how to write an anti-corruption law than what was bought by the Ugandan government for top dollar to get what on paper would then put you up in the global doing business rankings. All the nice things that would then be used to scorecard you would be getting you as higher ratings as it's almost possible to get. Right? But in one of those sort of perverse moments of beauty, when Matt Lant and I showed up to do a workshop in Kampala a few years ago, what was the screaming headline in the newspaper, literally on the day we arrived? 200 million shilling project from DFID cancelled because of corruption scandal. So you have this wonderful system that can look fantastic, that can be scorecarded internationally as exemplary, that can just not actually do the work that it is needing to be done. Right? And I think this is the dynamic that we see repeated in a whole range of different sectors. The reason for writing the book that we did was to combine the 6 different sectors of expertise in which the 3 of us work and sort of show that this phenomenon was just happening no matter where you see it. Right? It's most graphic, I think, and most insistent in the space of justice, because it's the hardest sector to reform and the one that everyone sort of agrees in principle is really important. But there are just so many other instances in which something like that can occur as well. The state of Tamil Nadu recently was counted as having 627 indicators for its education system, and not one of those 627 had anything to do with whether kids actually learn stuff in school. It was all to do with whether the buildings in the playground are in compliance with safety laws, about whether the toilets are the right distance from the school building, and all these things that would qualify you then to be in the status of an official government-run school, but there's nothing in any of that documentation that actually focuses on whether the system is actually doing what it's supposed to be doing. And that, I hope you are starting to see, is something that is really, really where we need to be focusing our energy. I mentioned Paul Romer before, saying that, that one of the reasons I think that this exists is because our prevailing systems were not built to do the kind of work we are now asking them to do. And this is what we call sort of the square pegs in the round hole problem, that we've set up a system to do one thing and now find it asking it to do another, and worrying why this doesn't do what it's supposed to do. When most of what we're now seeing, I would suggest, at least the binding constraint type issues, the issues that we don't know how to do and yet which stop us doing everything else, are these questions around in the adaptive space, where humans, like in the space of education, where the work requires humans with lots of social interaction, with lots of discretion, and with oftentimes a lot of resistance to what they're doing, trying to implement, right? It's what the work of regulators is involved in. It's what the work of taxation officers is about, right? It's the work of curative care. And all of those questions are not ones that are solvable by technocratic reform alone. At some point, there has to be a human agent introduced into all of that system, and we do not have systems that are able to incorporate what those particular agents might need to do. The last bit that I want to focus on is on why we think this approach that I'm going to just briefly outline shortly might stand a better chance of succeeding where others have failed. Right? We take our intellectual history seriously. We're very conscious of the ways in different organizations and people and intellectuals have thought about these questions, but I think one of my favorites is from Indonesia, back in the period just before the advent of independence of Indonesia, when one of Indonesia's most famous education reformers, Ki Hajar Dewantara, noted that of all these options presented to us, most of these fit so ill with their own style or is so far removed from it that we can use it at best as a decoration and not as material to build with. I just love that, right? This idea that so much of development is just decoration. It's cute. It looks nice. We can hang it on the wall. We can celebrate it as some form of exotica. But it's not the material that has local authenticity, that has the resonance with the local context and culture in which it finds itself, and thus can never be owned, operated, and implemented by the people whose job it ultimately will be to do this kind of work. So this is a critique 80 plus years now in the making. And if you look at the work of Charles Lindblom, of Hirschman himself, Dennis Rondinelli, Jim Scott, every decade pretty much since the 1940s and 50s and 60s and 70s, someone has come up with a lament around all of this. Right? Well, if we're going to stand a better chance of doing that, I think we need to have a pretty good account of why these previous critiques, all taught to subsequent generations of development professionals, didn't really succeed in doing the work that they did. And our argument for this is that the critique itself was largely right. There wasn't that there was some deep flaw with what they were saying. The problem was that this never mapped onto a social movement, that there was no solution ever offered to that. There was lots of critique, lots of worry that we were just doubling down on technical reforms and not creating a space for doing this more adaptive kind of work. But there was the theory of change, in some sense, was almost exclusively built around what intellectual elites themselves were saying, rather than actually trying to build this out into a much broader social movement. So, as Martin indicated at the beginning, one of the things that we did right from the beginning with our book, for example, was to give it away, was to say, if the people we're really most serious about trying to meet here are frontline and mid-level officials in Uganda, trying to deal with anti-corruption issues, then you're probably looking at a month's wages to buy a nice book from Oxford University Press. So we did a deal with our press just to give the whole book away so that we can make it freely available to anyone via the internet so that it can be put into the hands of as many people as possible. We also didn't want to have a theory of change that said, oh, we imagine that somehow these people are going to read a 250-page book and suddenly have an epiphany and move out and change the world, right? This is the kind of stuff we're calling for here is the equivalent of learning a foreign language, learning a musical instrument, learning a new sport. You have to do this kind of work. Systems, teams of people have to learn how to do this kind of work if they're actually going to be doing it. It's not just a matter of showing up for a capacity building training session and getting 9 out of 10 on your multiple choice test and thinking now I'm all empowered, I can go out and do this kind of work, right? The skills associated with doing this work are very much learning by doing kinds of tasks. So as a companion to the book, we built out a whole training program that, again, we gave away for free to people, but that we encouraged teams of people to do, not individuals to do. So we've had well over 1,000 people go through that program at the moment. The retention rates have been extraordinarily high by online course kinds of standards. But this has been a really big effort on our part to really try and learn from and engage with frontline people actually doing this kind of work. And it's been one of the great highlights of our careers almost to be able to put together something like this and then just reach thousands of people, not just 60 or 70 or so in nice rooms like this. We are sort of crazy ambitious in terms of what we are trying to reach with this, with not just with our work, I should stress, but also with a broader grouping of people as well. So into that even bigger space, because we're not so presumptuous to think that we've now cracked the code and everybody should get with our program and run around doing isomorphic versions of what I've just described to you. What we very much wanted to be super committed to was building out this whole global social movement. To do that, in 2014, we set up the Doing Development Differently network, the DDD network. This was a group that initially convened in Harvard in 2014, in London in 2015, Manila 2016, Jakarta 2017, and in November of this year, the Germans will host it in Berlin. Again, the idea here is not to try and preach to the world some new pill that they should take and that this will somehow solve all their problems. It's to create a big convening space where a whole array of different organizations engaging with these kinds of challenges that I've just described, who wake up every day, who's trying to fulfill the kinds of ambitious targets that their governments have set, but who so often find the prevailing incentive structures, the prevailing instruments available to them, often through the big organizations like the World Bank, as being part of their problem and not part of their solution. And if they have somehow managed to figure out a better way of doing that, we want to have a convening space where these kinds of ideas can be shared. And so the Doing Development Differently movement is about trying to build this out from the bottom up and do what we can to try and make that space as inclusive as possible with regards to having a whole array of different actors engaging with these kinds of questions. Some of it's kind of very boring and prosaic. A lot of the real work of doing this kind of stuff at scale will require a whole different administrative apparatus. It will require different accounting systems. It will require different procurement systems. Right? None of us know how to do that. Someone out there does, and we want to try and find that person so that the imperatives of a different reporting structure and the imperatives of a more adaptive approach to doing this thing can somehow be reconciled. These are very different ways of functioning, actually. And yet, to avoid being hauled before some committee to explain why your work is not just a waste of money, you have to be able to have really effective reporting systems in place to be able to implement this, to account for this, to procure this, and to evaluate this. And all of that is work remaining to be done. But the DDD network is the forum and the space in and through which we hope something like the solutions to these challenges will begin to emerge. Right? So that's really what we've done with this particular agenda, and both in terms of reaching out to the thousands through the book itself and making it freely available through the online training program, to really focus on those people who will learn and teach us and teach everybody else how to do this kind of approach, and then building that into this broader commitment to the Doing Development Differently. What is this thing I'm actually talking about? Let me just very quickly conclude by giving you a brief description of that, and then some examples from around the world of where people are trying to do that. If you look at the way in which the big development agencies work or the small NGOs work, they all have particular strengths and they all have particular weaknesses, and we're trying to really find a way of reconciling what those two strengths and weaknesses are. Much of the work of our prevailing systems presumes that we know up front most of what we need to know. Right? Well, huge amounts of energy, effort, and prestige goes into designing projects and policies of one kind or other, 300, 700 pages long oftentimes, because these all need to be specified up front. Right? So you have these huge amounts of time and energy and effort that go into producing these things called projects. Or, at the other end of the spectrum, your favorite NGO, my favorite NGOs are running around the world doing very niche, targeted interventions, trying to help very specific people in very specific places solve very particular kinds of problems. And that has a very different kind of logic and a very different kind of claiming apparatus around it as well. But I don't think you have seen countries reach this kind of ambition that is being asked of them in the Sustainable Development Goals by doubling down on just doing a whole array of these much smaller kinds of things. The enormous amounts of planning required up front versus doing this in a sort of boutique kind of way. You have M&E systems built into our big projects, but they're largely around compliance. Have you done what the rules told you to do, and have you thus avoided being hauled before some disciplinary group to explain your actions? Or we do evaluation where most of this occurs months or if not years after the time in which any of the feedback from that kind of system might actually be useful to the system itself. I was a peer reviewer for a major World Bank review of whether we as an organization are a knowledge bank. Are we in fact a learning organization 20 years after 1994, when the very famous Wappenham's report was written, asking precisely that kind of question then? Right? No was the answer in 1994. No again was the answer in 2014, when the bank itself asked itself, do we in fact learn systematically from our successes and failures? Right? The bank itself recognizes this. Right? Has any of that fundamentally changed the DNA of how we function, of how we operate on a day-to-day basis? Has any of that responded to the diagnostics of why, in fact, we're not such a learning organization? It's because we're stuck in these particular structures that were exactly the right way to build a bridge and exactly the wrong way to engage with justice reform, women's empowerment, and the inclusion of marginalized ethnic groups. Right? Asking a system to do what it cannot do and was not designed to do is just a recipe for doing things in a very inefficient and in often cases failed kind of way. The problem-driven iterative adaptation approach, on the contrary, tries to focus relentlessly on what people's problems are. We are not and should not see ourselves as being in the solution-selling business. And so much of what I think elite intellectuals do is think that their job is to tell people what to do. We're smart people. We have nice degrees from fancy places. We're not real experts until we can actually tell people what the answers to their problems are. And that's exactly the right way to think about medical problems. I think it's exactly the wrong way to think about a large slice, not all, but a pretty large slice of the development business, is that we don't actually know what needs to happen in these situations, or at least if we do, those responses have to be the second response to much more serious processes of examining what the actual problems are that people face. That would be itself just an incredible radical shift in how we do development. If we actually began by taking seriously, what do you think is the problem you're actually trying to wrestle with here? Rather than seeing ourselves as the business of the best practice guardians, the people who run a whole bunch of fancy experiments that enables them to impute to themselves the guardians of what works in development because we have rigorous evidence that shows that we've proved that to be the case. Right? There is a place, of course, for doing that kind of work, and that's what serious scholarship in some sense exists to do. But for a large part of these kinds of problems that we're now addressing, there isn't an answer to these questions. There is only the answer you negotiate, only the answer you craft in response to the idiosyncratic manifestation of that particular problem in the particular place in which it occurs. All of this to map out and experiment with an array of different approaches requires a very robust authorizing environment. You cannot do this kind of work where you're on very uncertain journeys. You don't embark on long voyages of discovery unless you have that kind of journey itself authorized by the people that are in a position to do so. And rather than seeing the M&E task as about compliance or providing very late-term forms of feedback, you have to build this right into the very everyday existence of a development project. So the M&E systems become live. They're not things that occur statically. The job is much less about trying to adhere compliance to existing rules and much more about, are you solving incrementally the kind of problems that you originally set out to do? Or if not, can you make the necessary adjustments in order to be able to do that kind of work in the right kind of way? Then you get to scale by being able to build that out into a much bigger community of people doing this kind of work, by letting practitioners themselves be the vehicles through which the authenticity and the legitimacy of these kinds of solutions then starts to become available to people working on similar-ish kinds of problems around the world. Let me just fast forward to just giving you some examples of where this work is manifest in the world, and then we'll let go those people that need to go, and we'll have some time afterwards for Q&A. We're starting to see this kind of approach, or versions of it, not necessarily full deep dive versions of this occurring in an array of different places. The last 5 World Development Reports have all created space for thinking and talking about this kind of work in a whole array of different ways. A major report we did on service delivery in the Middle East a few years ago really exploited this whole array, huge variety in the standard deviation space about learning from this positive deviance, the ways in which these different countries are engaging with problems for which they have clear policies on what should be happening, and yet vastly different degrees of attainment about what they're actually achieving. Some of the major donors are beginning to create not just sort of cute pilot money for this stuff, actually putting real money behind it, and some of it, I think, being done most powerfully through Oxford Policy Management here in Oxford. I've had some of the best conversations I've had about the wisdom and folly of this kind of approach have been done through the work coming out of Oxford here. An array of different country programs around the world have started to think about this kind of work. Some of those are actually starting to come to fruition now, the most recent of those being a work in Mozambique. We have a whole adaptive fellows program that the president of the World Bank has pushed. That's a different kind of conversation in some respects, but at least it's trying to open up the space through what the president calls a science of delivery agenda, really trying to figure out much more seriously how we can do a much better job of being able to learn from our successes, learn from our failures, but engage in these vastly more complex and complicated interventions that we are now wrestling with. We've set up this thing called the Global Delivery Initiative, a consortium of 38 different organizations from around the world who all exist and try and pool their collective knowledge through the articulation of case studies about how they dealt with these complex challenges that emerged unanticipated in the course of delivering development projects. How were these problems solved? How were they able to be, solutions able to be found when they were never anticipated up front? Right? We have this whole community of practice that I mentioned set up in motion through the original meeting of the Doing Development Differently Network, and a whole bunch of really interesting organizations that I think are working on some of the most pressing challenges. Just last Friday, I had a wonderful meeting with a team doing justice reform in Afghanistan. When they reached out to me 2 years ago, I said I had to work with these guys because they're working in the hardest sector in the hardest country right now. And they are willing to sign up for a 3-year effort to try and make this kind of work. And I just tear up talking with people like that because it makes anything that we do, certainly that I do, seem so safe and so tame compared to actually waking up every day thinking my job is to actually figure out how to fix the justice system in a country like Afghanistan. Right? Just amazing. The work of Mercy Corps, a group that works with refugees and a large, big 2 million refugee camps in Congo. They wake up every day doing something like this to try and make these refugee camps give people a slightly more dignified life than they might otherwise. They come to this kind of work feeling deeply frustrated that the prevailing systems don't create the space for them to do the kind of work they want to do. They find in this kind of work a different space for operating and for implementing and doing this kind of work. And then there's an array of sort of Beltway Bandit type groups, as we call it in Washington, that are now emerging to try and engage in this kind of work. The point is, and I'm perhaps too deep in the woods to provide an objective account of all of this. I really acknowledge that. My point is that someone has to start somewhere with doing this kind of work. It's an invitation more broadly through these kinds of presentations to try and bring in as many of you as might be interested in doing this kind of work. But from a School of Public Policy like we have here at Blavatnik, to really trying to open up this middle space between the designers and the evaluators and saying, let's have a revolution in the implementation space, because that, to me, is what's going to decide whether we achieve these fantastical goals or even just a small fraction of them. Any policy is only as good as its implementation. Our prevailing systems are not doing that work. Our prevailing aid systems were not designed to help those kinds of systems improve. We have to do a better one. I would wager that something like what a better system will look like will be a version of PDIA or some variant thereof. And I invite you to be part of that, not because you're getting with my program, but because you're getting with the program of a vast community of people all around the world themselves, beginning from different standing points, entering the world in the different sectors in different ways, in different places. But we want to try and connect all of that kind of knowledge and over time practice what we preach, so that what comes out of this itself will be something that a social movement, a community of development professionals have designed fit for purpose to meet the kinds of challenges that we've set ourselves. And I hope that you can be part of that and that you find in some of that at least a space for thinking and acting differently. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Michael, for a great talk. Those of you who do have to leave, feel free to. For those of you who do want to stay and take a first step towards being part of this social movement, questions would be a good first step. So we're going to take questions in batches of 3. So please keep them very brief and questions rather than comments, and introduce yourself when you're speaking. So we had 1 here, 2, and 3. We can start in this order to make things easier. Oh, you have one. Can you introduce yourself, please?
My name is Vafa. I'm a DPhil student here at the Blavatnik School. By the way, is this recorded or not? It is.
Yes.
Okay. So
everything you say can and will be using it.
So just I want to ask a very kind of essential question, I guess, about the development work. A philosopher called Larry Temkin recently gave a series of lectures here in Oxford, relying partly on, very much on empirical analysis by Angus Deaton, to make a claim that aid work, even when it's effective, in aggregate, is problematic because it undermines the very goal of state capability. So projects that, for example, I think.
Can you keep it short?
Yeah.
Please?
So let's say the state house, the courthouse project, even if it was effective, I think the claim is something like, if it undermines the connection, if the foreign influence undermines the connection between citizens and the state, this itself over time is a problem. And I won't give you my take on his thesis, but I'm interested in your take.
Sure. Okay.
Thanks. Yep, over here.
Thank you so much for being here. My name is Salim. I'm from Syria and Sweden, and one of the MPP students here at the school. And my question departs from your work on the MENA region. As you might know very, very well, there is a current conversation now within the bank about what might be the prospect of a post-conflict Syria, and more largely a post-conflict Middle East, so Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and eventually Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and maybe Lebanon as well might join the list. And my question is how, because we were told in official and unofficial conversation that the financial aspect of the reconstruction is not going to be the main component of any conversation, but rather more the political economy and the social dynamics, etc. And I would love to hear your thoughts on what might be the crucial elements of such conversation, especially that it seems that the megastructure aspect of the project might dominate at some point, and this is something for us as civil society and diaspora groups is very terrifying, because we don't want hospitals to be built and then bombed. And the second question is, when we are not capable of contributing through official state institutions, is there, through PIDA, a place for us to contribute? Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Jamie.
Thanks. My name is Jamie Walsh. I'm a DPhil student here at the Blavatnik School. I wanted to pick up on two slides you presented. The first on the importance of history in understanding policy, and the second on the development trajectories of the low-income countries and how long it would take them to progress. And like linking those two points together, I'd be curious, what was the development trajectory of the rich countries now historically, and were they following linear paths? And if they weren't, what were the junctures, and how can you try and replicate those junctures?
Thank you. So Mike, you have 4 easy questions there.
I did a whole book on history and development policy, and I've done a bunch of papers trying to problematize the whole notion of the non-linear ways in which trajectories of change unfold, and the way that complicates a lot of our claims about effectiveness. So I think I've thought about that particular issue. Why I caveated what I said about taking things seriously but not literally was just to say, look, even if over the relatively short time frame that we have, 20 years for the best part, from the mid-90s to the mid-second decade of the 20th century, there's just that time frame is itself too short to do anything other than just these crude extrapolations about the pace and trajectory of change. So we just began with that. Well, you can look at a country like Haiti, for example, in one of our different slide that we have. Haiti's been notionally independent for 200 years. And if you assume it was Somalia levels today when it was granted independence, and then sort of look where it is now, that's going to be another 400-year journey until it gets into a space even remotely like what would be needed to be in the space of a middle-income country, let alone a high-income country. So on certain countries which one can reasonably claim that there has been a long-run time period of change, it really has taken a lot of countries a long period of time. It's been shorter in Vietnam, way shorter in China, way shorter in South Korea, and all the Asia Tiger kind of countries. But even there, it's been decades in terms of the transition period. So Even so, I mean, I think to the extent that you would think you would see some kinds of changes occurring in those short-run periods of time, I think that we're still the pace and trajectories of change, especially for countries that are dealing negative. I mean, that there's got to be just even a breaking of that negative of the negative nature of that trajectory if we're going to be engaging with that in a more constructive kind of way. Run which one on? I think these questions of. I think for me, sort of what a higher order point in all of these discussions is the legitimacy of the change process that's put in motion, right? And I think so much of why I think the Hiranjara quote that I mentioned from Indonesia was why this all ends up looking like decoration, right? It looks like decoration because it's not us. It's not legitimate. It's not of our essence. And when the kind of work that's being done in the name of development ends up looking like decoration, I think that's when in a Rousseauian sense, but the social contract, the citizen-state connection starts to be severed. When you set expectations really high, and when the lived experience of that is just on an everyday basis is so vastly inferior to all of that, and where the minimal credibility of the state is required to do that kind of work, any form of action that compromises that, it seems to me, is deeply problematic. One of my heroes in development, one of my mentors in this whole business, Scott Guggenheim, who's overseen so much of the wonderful work in Indonesia, but over the last 8 or 9 years or so, been the lead development point man for all the work of the international agencies in Afghanistan. And his big critique after a whole career, and is now in his 60s, spent 40 years doing this kind of work. And what his lament is that the aid business does not see itself as being in the nation building business. It sees itself on the targeting of specific people in the specific places business, and never figuring out how to build this larger collective project that people can feel that they have a vested interest in, called the state, called the nation, that they want to be part of. And my concern is that so much of the way in which research and evaluation is being done is it's just doubling down on these very seemingly the need to estimate causally clean ways of doing things that are exactly how you get published in elite journals, but not how you build a social contract, not how you build a legitimate compact between citizen and state. And if that is the collective wisdom of people that have been doing this in the toughest places for decades of their life, I think I at least accord much more veracity to that kind of claiming than I do to whether or not what I'm doing is going to get published in the APSR or something like that, because nothing like what I'm talking about will end up in that kind of space. That's okay. I'm secure enough in my my identity in my career to make my peace with that. But I think that we have a moral obligation and a strategic obligation to be engaging with these questions and worrying much more about the legitimacy of the change process that we make. And I guess I haven't heard these lectures that you described, but if it's a version of even when we succeed, we change the way in which this is working, then yeah, that's why I mentioned the Rwanda example. I mean, that the world of a 20-year-old now in Rwanda versus the life that same person will be living when they're 52, the entire way in which their being is structured, the way in which they think of themselves, the way in which they imagine a future, the way in which they engage with their fellow citizens, the way in which they engage with the state will be completely revolutionized by all of that. And it's the very severing of that. And this is how I teach my class in the Kennedy School. I say why development is so freaking hard is because it does this. The creative destruction and Schumpeterian sort of forces are put in motion all the time around these kinds of things. It's what classical political theory has told us since the beginning. It's what Sam Huntington tells us about, what Frank Fukuyama, a whole bunch of people tell us that this has been a big fulcrum around which everything has fallen apart in an Achabe kind of sense, even from a literary point of view. So it doesn't surprise me that people are making that kind of critique. I'm vain enough or silly enough or idealistic enough to not want to bail on the idea of development, on the practice of doing development. I just think we can do so much freaking better than what we're currently doing, right? The world record for the number of co-authors on an academic paper is what? This is cocktail party points, but it's great. It's a great answer. The answer is 5,417, right? That's how many people it took to crack the weight of identifying and measuring the Higgs boson particle, right? in real sciences, where real knowledge is accumulating, you can hitch the brains of 5,417 PhD in physics to measure the Higgs boson particle to within 0.25% accuracy. Right? Why can't the collective brains of people doing social science, they can't hitch their brains together to do something like that? We can't even write a two-authored book on the World War I as the major event of the 20th century. But we can do so much better. Humans have got to be able to do so much. The woman who just won Australian of the Year award, what did she win it for doing? She's figured out how to get information and electricity to pass along singular atoms placed back to back that are 1/10,000th the width of a breadth of human hair. Right? That's what people can do who are in a world where you can break down problems and get that level of awesomeness being achieved by human brains. Why can we not design a better aid system than that, when in other realms of human inquiry, what people can do is just so much, seemingly so much more impressive? Why do we even have to have conversations about the about the weirdness of aid when if we could imagine and if we could build out a better system, I think we could do so much better. The answer, of course, is politics, the prevailing incentives that are baked into the way in which our systems are structured, but that's all known too. There's not a big secret there, but we just got to be committed, as our predecessors, our great-grandparents were, in trying to wrestle with the bear, to take on these big challenges and figure out what a better way of doing that might look like. And that's what I'm committed to try to doing, is to provide doing what little bit I can do to try and motivate and push forward that kind of work. What have I not addressed?
So two questions here, one on rebuilding the Middle East and sort of focusing on politics rather than finance.
Too, sorry, you have to come back to the speech.
And one about PDA outside of formal institutional contexts.
Yeah. I think I'll do the second one first because that's slightly easier. Once you give away your book, once you give away your training program, all sorts of crazy stuff starts to happen. Everybody starts reinventing themselves and selling off and appropriating your slides and inventing themselves as a PDA expert, and Boston Consulting Group people are making all sorts of money off this, which is a second-order problem. I don't care. But the upside of all of that giving away is that the whole bunch of people now that are just, if not treating our book as a recipe and a how-to manual for fixing a difficult situation, are just trying to do stuff. And I actually get a bigger buzz almost out of getting random emails out of people saying, I read this stuff and it didn't really teach me anything I didn't already know, but what it did was improve my mental health, because what I do every day and what I tell the system I do are schizophrenic. They're just really, really different things. And I hate living in the world where I lie to my boss and to my reporting system about what I actually do, when what I'm doing is kind of a version of what you say I should be doing. And I think that's happening in a whole bunch of places. I love it when some grizzly 40-year development veteran comes up to me afterwards and said, didn't teach me anything I didn't already know, but you've just made my life a little better because you give me words to talk about a deep inner angst that I've had for a long period. And I would wager that a lot of people are having their own versions around all of that kind of stuff. And if that's one unintended but happy consequence of being very open and dispersing of one's ideas, so much the better. I'm not punting. It's the tension of the highest order for me to stand in front of you and say, yeah, I basically know what to do in the Middle East. If only they put me in charge, I'd know. I have no idea. I have so much respect for people that sign up every day to do that kind of work, and they are the ones that should be the ones engaging in all of that. That said, one of the things that I was most pleased with in this big report we did on the Middle East was the fact that Middle Eastern citizens and public officials themselves were just so grateful that the international agencies weren't coming in and telling them what to do. We were mapping out their world. What we could do as international agents was actually provide the equivalent of a Google map of sort of where successes in their schooling systems and their health systems were occurring. So the very essence of doing complex work is that it just generates these huge standard deviations. It works great over here, it muddles through over there, and it's diabolically awful over there. And you construct a mathematical average to tell you what the average effect was. The reality is there's just wild standard deviations everywhere. And if that's a pretty robust principle on which to start, then I think from a nerdy researcher point of view, one of the huge contributions we can make to these really vexed situations is to at least begin to put some evidentiary material to talk about what is going on in this space. Where is the positive deviance occurring? Where is someone, somewhere, somehow doing something that, in spite of everything, has been able to make that system work? So one of the highlights of doing that particular book was being able to look at education and systems in Palestine. For example, I'm working with a colleague of mine who was from Palestine, who was crying a lot of the time we were doing this work, not because she was sad, but she was so happy. Like we actually found an amazing school in Palestine that was producing kids that were scoring at average international levels on their tests. This is a school in which 75% of the fathers are dead or in jail, which is in the middle of nowhere. It's not a sort of a rich school on the borderlands of any of the major cities. You have to drive in a bulletproof car with 8-inch thick doors for 2 hours just to even get there. And we spent a whole week hanging out with these teachers, with the principal, with the mid-level officials, with the parents, with the students themselves. How is it that you guys are just able to take exactly the same raw materials as everybody else and combine that into something so amazing? And we produced a video over this. But the reason my colleague was crying was this: you know how the rest of the world sees my country? As victims or perpetrators. That's the only way in which we're ever portrayed. And for once, we're just being shown as normal people, showing up for work every day, trying to make a humble school work well. And you know what? We can do it darn well. We're actually pretty good at this. And that was amazing to being able to see. And I think if we just self-flagellate around what things that aren't working, but can somehow acknowledge that reality, but have a space and an evidentiary resource material to help us to map out what the variation is looking, and then do deep dive diagnostic work to explain where these successes are occurring. Doing all the qualifying one needs to do around selection effects and controlling for and all the things one would need to do is in regular social science to understand that. I think so much can be gained politically by demonstrating to people that they themselves have succeeded at doing this, not because someone out from the outside came in. And let me give you a sense of how low the bar is here. In this amazing school that I talked about, that I just mentioned, there was a principal that had been working in the system for 28 years doing this kind of heroic work and building up schools. And I said to her, wow, this is amazing. How often have representatives from international agencies come and hung out and learned from you about what you're doing? And she looked up and said, I think you're the second. How can it be that someone is doing this unbelievable work under the most difficult circumstances in the world, and this bar is that 2 people in her entire career have actually bothered to consult her about what she's doing? Right? 2 days later, I happened to be in a big meeting where a bunch of international agencies were giving a big report, and room full of about 200 people, and here was a bunch of white guys from Washington with their nice little bar graphs, sort of endlessly telling people what they should be doing to look like or be those kind of people. That same principal sat in the back seat for the entire 2 hours and was not consulted once by anybody. And I said, there's only one person in this room who's figured out how to make any of this work. Get her up on stage, get her to give an extemporaneous 10-minute speech about it would be vastly better than anything you guys are doing. That's what I mean, that the bar is low. I mean, why should it be rocket science that the people who've actually figured out how to make stuff work in really difficult circumstances are not put in the spotlight? Why does it have to be someone like me who's sort of expected to be able to come up with the answer to that? I can do something. What I can do is help people do mapping. I can help them do the positive deviance work. I can help share and disseminate that kind of work. But I don't have the answer to that. They do. And that's for this social contract issue to be sustained and for that to become the basis on which something like a more effective society is built. That's got to be the way in which we do this thing called development business. And so I'm hopeful because I see instances of that kind of stuff happening. It just astounds me on an hourly basis that has to be news to people about how we do development. When we live in a world where 5,417 physicists can hitch their brains to measure Higgs boson particles and where people can design mechanisms for sharing information that are 1/10,000th the width of a human hair. If they can do that, why can't we do something way better than what we're doing right now? And I think that's the low bar that we've unfortunately have before us. We've got to be able to do better than that.
Great. Well, I think on that note, we should probably wrap up.
All right.
Michael will be around here for a few minutes afterward, I think, if you have any pressing questions you didn't get in. But otherwise, please join me in thanking Michael for a great talk.